He walked through the front door of his childhood home, carrying a cracked plastic bag and wearing a jacket with a hole in the elbow, and his stepmother looked at him like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "You still can't afford a real coat," she said. He smiled, said nothing. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 hours earlier, he had signed a deal worth $400 million. And he had chosen very deliberately to come home looking like this. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. If you're new here, subscribe, because what happens next will change how you see everything. The cab smelled like pine air freshener and old cigarettes, and Marcus Hale sat in the back seat with his hands on his knees, watching the neighborhoods change outside the window. He knew this route by heart. He'd taken it 100 times, first as a kid on the school bus, then as a teenager hitching rides with whoever would take him, then later in his beat-up Honda that leaked oil on every driveway it sat in. He knew the exact moment the houses went from small and tired to slightly larger and slightly less tired. He knew the gas station on the corner of Birchwood and Route 9, where the sign still said unleaded, even though they hadn't sold it that way in 15 years. He knew all of it. But tonight, he was seeing it differently. "You sure this is the right address?" the driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. The tone wasn't rude exactly, but it had that edge, the kind people use when they're trying to be polite, while also saying you don't look like you belong here. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I grew up here." The driver said nothing else. Marcus paid cash. $22 for the ride, plus a $5 tip that the driver looked at like it was either too much or too little. Marcus couldn't tell which. He stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk in front of the house on Delwood Lane and stood there for a moment, with his plastic bag hanging from one fist. The house was a split-level colonial, the kind that had looked impressive in 1987 and had been slowly losing the argument ever since. The gutters needed cleaning. The front porch light had been replaced with a motion sensor bulb that flickered every time the wind moved the oak tree near the driveway. There was a new car parked out front, a silver Mercedes-year-old at most, that sat beside his stepmother's white Cadillac, like they were in a competition for who could look more out of place on Delwood Lane. The silver one's new, he thought. Whose is that? He didn't pull out his phone to text ahead. He hadn't called to say he was coming. He'd made that choice on purpose 3 weeks ago, when the idea had first come to him, not as a plan exactly, more like a question he needed answered. If I showed up as nobody, just Marcus, just the guy who left, what would they say? What would they do? Who would they be? He'd wanted to know. He walked up the 3 front steps and knocked. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, and then the door swung open, and there she was. Patricia Hale, née Conroy, formerly Mrs. Gerald. Conroy, before she'd become Mrs. Richard Hale stood in the doorway in a silk blouse and a pearl necklace at 7:30 on a Wednesday evening, holding a glass of white wine and looking at Marcus like he was a piece of furniture she didn't remember ordering. She was 40 years old, and she looked every bit of it in the way that expensive maintenance makes a person look perfect from a distance practiced up close. Her hair was highlighted, her nails were done. She smelled like something French and cost-heavy. She looked at him. She looked at the plastic bag. She looked at his jacket. Marcus. Not a question. Not a greeting, really. Just a confirmation that she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. "Hey, Patricia." A beat passed. "Your father didn't tell me you were coming." "I didn't tell him." He held up the bag slightly. "I brought some stuff. Shampoo, some canned goods. Thought you guys could use them." Patricia's eyes dropped to the bag. Something moved across her face, not quite contempt, but first cousin to it. "We're having dinner," she said. "I figured." She didn't move to let him in. Behind her, he could hear the sounds of the house silverware against plates, the low murmur of a television somewhere, a man's voice saying something, and then a woman's laugh. "Who else is here?" Marcus asked. "Brad and Courtney came for dinner." She said it the way people say things they want you to understand, carry weight like the names themselves were supposed to mean something. Brad was her son from her first marriage. Courtney was Brad's wife of 14 months, who had 3 opinions about everything and shared all of them freely. Marcus nodded. Great. I'd love to see them. Another beat, longer this time. You could have called, Patricia said, not moving. I know. It's a little, Marcus, we're in the middle of. Patricia. His voice was level, quiet, perfectly calm. I'd like to come inside my father's house. Something shifted in her expression. A recalculation. Whatever she was about to say next got swallowed. She stepped back and let him in. The dining room was the kind of room that had been redecorated twice in the last 6 years and still couldn't decide what it wanted to be. There was a farmhouse table that was too big for the space candles that were mostly decorative, and a centerpiece of artificial flowers that Patricia kept because she'd read somewhere they photographed well. Marcus's father, Richard Hale, was at the head of the table. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, heavier than he'd been 5 years ago, in the way that men get heavy when they stop fighting it. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome, and now was just settled like everything in it had found its place and was staying there. He looked up when Marcus walked in. For just a second, just one single second, his face did something real. His eyes widened, and there was something in them that looked almost like relief. Like some part of him had been waiting for this for years without knowing how to ask for it. Then it closed back up. Marcus, his father said, standing halfway from his chair and then stopping like he'd started a gesture and lost the nerve to finish it. We didn't know you were. I know, Dad. Sorry to drop in. Marcus crossed the room and put his hand on his father's shoulder, one firm, brief grip. His father's hand came up and patted his forearm once. That was them. That had always been them. Brad looked up from his phone, which he'd been looking at under the table in the way people do when they think no one notices. He was 36, built wide with the kind of confidence that comes from being the only boy in a house where his mother controlled the thermostat. He had on a sport coat over a polo shirt, which Marcus always privately found a little try-hard for a Wednesday dinner at home. Marcus. Brad's smile was about 40% genuine. Man, you look. He stopped, reconsidered. How long's the drive from where are you these days? Out west, Marcus said. Right, you look like it. He laughed at his own joke. Courtney laughed too, right on cue. Courtney was small and blonde, and operated entirely on social cues. She laughed when Brad laughed, frowned when Brad frowned, and had opinions about Marcus that she had formed entirely based on what Patricia and Brad had told her before she'd ever met him. Sit down, Richard said, already halfway back into his chair, already looking at Patricia. Get him a plate. Patricia had set the bag Marcus brought on the side table near the front door, the way you'd put something you intended to throw away later. She went to the kitchen without saying anything. Marcus pulled out the empty chair at the far end of the table opposite his father and sat down. So, Brad said, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed in that way he had, the way that said, I'm relaxed, but I'm also in charge here. What brings you back? Business passing through. Visiting, Marcus said. Visiting. Brad repeated the word like it was mildly suspicious. No offense, man, but it's been, 2 years since you were last home? 3. Almost 3. 3 years. Brad shook his head, smiling. Dad's been asking about you. Right, Dad? Richard picked up his wine glass. Brad. What? He has. I'm just saying. Brad unfolded his arms and put his elbows on the table. You know we were worried, Marcus. We didn't know what was going on with you out there. Mom said she tried calling and... She's not my mom, Marcus said. The table went quiet. He hadn't said it hard. He hadn't loaded it with anything. He'd just said it factual, clean, matter of fact, the way you'd correct a wrong address or a misspelled name. Brad's smile went stiff at the edges. Right. Yeah, sorry. Patricia. He picked up his fork. She still tried calling. I know. I got the messages. Marcus poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. I've been busy. Busy with what? Courtney asked, and then immediately looked at Brad like she was checking whether she'd been allowed to speak. Marcus looked at her. Work, he said. What kind of work are you doing now? His father asked. And there was something careful in the way he asked it, careful and a little hopeful, like a man who's been bracing for bad news for so long that he's almost stopped expecting anything else. Marcus picked up a roll from the breadbasket. Consulting, he said. Consulting. Brad's tone was doing something complex. Like, IT stuff. Business stuff. Business stuff. You still doing that thing with the, what was it, the app? Something like that. Brad nodded slowly. Good money in that. Marcus took a bite of the roll, said nothing. Patricia came back from the kitchen with a plate chicken and roasted vegetables, the same meal she'd been making for company dinners since Marcus was 17, and set it in front of him without ceremony. She sat back down at her seat between Brad and Richard, and picked up her fork, and the conversation reformed around her return, the way water closes around a stone. We were talking about the Hendersons, she said to Richard, as if Marcus had never arrived. About the thing with their pool. And just like that, Marcus was background noise. He watched them. He'd always been good at that, at going quiet and watching. Growing up in this house, that skill had been survival. When you were the kid whose father remarried too fast, whose new stepmother had very clear ideas about whose children mattered and whose were inconveniences, you learned to watch. You learned to read rooms. You learned to notice who got the warmth and who got the performance of warmth. Patricia never disliked him openly. That would have been too easy to name. What she did was more precise than that. She managed him. She acknowledged him in public and arranged for him to be irrelevant in private. When he was a kid, she'd done it by scheduling things Brad's soccer games, Brad's school events, Patricia's book club, so that the house was always full of Patricia's life in a way that left no room for Marcus to belong to it. When he got older and started pushing back, started asking questions about money and college, and why Brad got the newer car, and he got whatever was left over, that's when the managing turned into something cooler. Your father works hard, she used to say. We all have to be realistic. He'd been 18 years old the last time she'd said something like that to him the week before he left for college, on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. He'd stood in this kitchen and told her he wasn't going to be realistic anymore, that he was going to find his own way. She'd looked at him with that specific expression. She had the one that was almost compassionate, almost respectful, but was really neither, and she'd said, I hope it works out for you, Marcus. I really do. Like she already knew it wouldn't. He'd thought about her saying that a lot over the past 16 years. He thought about it now, eating his chicken in silence while she told his father about the Hendersons' pool. Oi. So, what's in the bag? He looked up. Brad was looking at the side table by the door at the plastic grocery bag Marcus had brought in. Stuff? Marcus said. What kind of stuff? Shampoo. Couple cans of soup. Some things. Brad stared at him for a moment, and then a slow smile spread across his face. He looked at Courtney. She looked back. Then Brad looked at Patricia. Did you tell him? Brad asked. Patricia set down her fork. Brad. I'm serious. Does he know? Know what? Marcus asked. His father shifted in his chair. Dad sold 2 of the investment properties, Brad said, leaning forward now, the smile turning into something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction. Took a bath on the market thing last year. But they're fine. They're doing fine, Marcus. You don't need to bring soup cans. There it was. Marcus looked at his father. Richard was staring at his plate with the expression of a man who'd been having this conversation in his head all evening and had already lost it. I didn't know about the properties, Marcus said. Yeah, well? Brad sat back. Stuff happens. We manage. We're not, it's fine. But the point is, you don't need to show up here with... I wanted to, Marcus said. I wanted to bring something. You wanted to. Brad said it like a verdict. Marcus, come on. You disappear for 3 years, don't call, don't visit. And then you show up on a random Wednesday with a grocery bag full of… Brad. His father's voice had an edge in it now. Low, but real. Brad stopped. The table was quiet again. Patricia picked up her wine glass. And Marcus looked around at all of them, at his father, who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. At Brad, who was so busy being the son who stayed that he'd never thought to ask whether staying was actually an act of love or an act of calculation. At Courtney, who understood almost nothing about this family except which side she'd chosen. At Patricia, who sat at this table like she'd won something and wasn't finished collecting on it, and he felt very clearly and very quietly that he had his answer. He'd come home to ask a question he hadn't known how to say out loud, and they'd answered it without knowing they were answering it. If you walked back in with nothing, who would they actually be? Now he knew. He picked up his fork and finished his dinner. He asked his father about a couple of things: the truck, the back fence that had been leaning since forever, a neighbor named Pete who used to coach Little League. His father answered every question with something that looked like relief. Like every small exchange was a hand reached across a very long distance. Patricia was quiet most of the time. Brad checked his phone under the table. Courtney talked about a renovation they were doing on their house in Westlake. After dinner, Marcus helped clear the plates. His father walked him to the door. You should have called, his father said. I know. Marcus put on his jacket. I'll call more, Dad, I promise. His father nodded slowly, looked down at the floor. Then, are you doing all right out there? Are you… I mean really, are you okay? Marcus put his hand on the door handle, looked at the man who had raised him with one hand while the other was always somewhere else. Better than I've ever been, he said. I'll explain some of it next time. His father nodded again. Okay, he said. Okay. Marcus opened the door. Patricia appeared in the hallway behind his father. She'd been in the kitchen, but she must have heard, and she looked at Marcus with that same expression she'd always had for him. It was good to see you, Marcus, she said. Take care of yourself. He looked at her for one long moment. You too, Patricia, he said. You too. And then he walked out into the dark and called the car, not a cab this time. The other number. The one that connected to the service his assistant had set up. The one that sent a black Escalade with tinted windows that would be here in 4 minutes. The one that nobody on Delwood Lane would think twice about, because people in black Escalades didn't have business on Delwood Lane. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold with his hands in the pockets of his jacket with the hole in the elbow, and he breathed. Behind him, the porch light flickered once in the wind and went out. He stood in the dark and thought about what he was going to do next. Because what happened in that house tonight, what he'd seen in each of their faces when he walked in with a grocery bag instead of a portfolio that wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. The Escalade arrived in exactly 4 minutes. The driver, a quiet man named Darnell, who had been driving for Marcus for 2 years and understood that silence was part of the job description, pulled up without fanfare, stepped out, and opened the rear door without being asked. Marcus got in. The door closed. The leather seat was warm. The interior smelled like clean air. Nothing else. For a moment, Marcus just sat there, not speaking, not moving, staring out the tinted window at the house on Delwood Lane. The porch light was still off. Through the front window, he could see the soft glow of the dining room, the shape of someone moving past Patricia, probably clearing the rest of the table. Where to Mr. Hale? Darnell asked. The hotel, Marcus said. Darnell pulled away from the curb, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Marcus watched the neighborhood unspool in reverse, the small houses getting slightly larger, slightly less tired, then giving way to the commercial strip on Route 9, the gas station, with its ancient unleaded sign, the CVS. The Applebee's, the long stretch of nothing particular that connected this part of the world to the interstate. His phone had 17 notifications he hadn't looked at since landing. He picked it up now and scrolled through them without urgency. A text from his COO, 2 emails from the legal team, a message from his head of acquisitions that said simply, "Singapore confirmed. Call when you can." He typed back tomorrow morning and put the phone face down on his knee. He looked out the window. He thought about his father's face when he'd walked in the door. That 1 second. That real, unguarded second before Richard Hale had closed it back up and gone back to being the man who didn't quite know how to be anyone's father. Marcus had been looking for that second for a long time. Not the version of his father that existed at the dining room table performing stability for Patricia's benefit, performing ease for Brad's benefit, but the actual man. The one who'd taught him to throw a baseball in the backyard when Marcus was 6, and Richard was still somebody's husband in the real sense of the word, before grief and loneliness had made him do something as human and as disastrous as marrying the wrong woman too fast. That second was why Marcus had made the trip. Not for Brad, not for Patricia, not for any of it. Just for that 1 second when his father saw him and something in his chest cracked open before the walls went back up. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. She answered on the second ring, which she always did, because she said answering on the first ring made her sound like she was waiting and answering. On the third made her sound like she had more important things to do, and the second ring was the exact right amount of professionalism. "How'd it go?" she asked, no preamble. They'd worked together for 4 years and had developed a communication style that was about 60% of a language they'd invented. "About how I expected," Marcus said, meaning exactly what I thought it would mean. A pause. Did they? They had no idea. Nobody figured it out. He leaned back against the headrest. "Brad asked me what kind of consulting work I do." There was a sound on her end that might have been a suppressed laugh. "What did you say?" "Business stuff." "Very descriptive." "I thought so." "And your dad?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He asked if I was really okay. Not the surface version of that question, the actual version. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that I'm better than I've ever been." Another pause. "Are you?" "Most days," he said. And that was the honest answer, which was why she had asked, and why he didn't dress it up any further. "Singapore confirmed," she said, moving on the way she always did when she'd gotten what she needed from a conversation. "The Meridian deal closes Tuesday. Chen wants a call before the weekend. I'll do it tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock my time. Already on the calendar." He could hear her typing. "Also, and I'm only mentioning this because I think you should know, a reporter from the Journal has been calling. Second time this week." "What do they want?" "Reaction piece on the Halloran acquisition. They know it was you." Marcus exhaled slowly. The Halloran acquisition had been the one that made Singapore possible, that had made Tuesday possible, that had turned a very large company into a very, very large company in the space of about 6 months. He'd structured it deliberately through 3 holding entities, specifically so that his name wouldn't surface immediately, and they'd found it in 8 weeks. He was genuinely impressed, not that it helped him. "Tell them no comment," he said. "I've told them no comment twice already. Tell them no comment a third time. I find it's usually the charm. Marcus, if they run something, they run something. I'm not doing press this quarter." He watched the hotel sign appear in the distance, a glass tower that sat at the edge of the city, like it was the first thing built and everything else had grown up around it. "I need you to do something else for me." "Okay." "I need everything on my father's financials. Not deep, I don't want to go inside his accounts. Just what's public or near public. Property records, anything on the investment losses Brad mentioned, whether there are any liens on the house." He paused. "And find out what you can about Brad Conroy. His business situation. His wife. What they own, what they owe." She didn't ask why, because she'd been doing this job long enough to understand that when Marcus Hale went quiet and started gathering information, it was because he was building something. She just said, "By tomorrow afternoon, whenever you can." Okay. He heard her typing. Get some sleep. I'll try. He hung up and watched the hotel getting closer. They were talking about him. He knew this the way you know things about people you've spent your life reading. He'd been back in his room on the 14th floor for less than 30 minutes when the knowing settled over him, comfortable and certain as an old coat. Back on Delwood Lane, the dishes were being done. The wine was being finished. And somewhere in that house, probably in the kitchen, probably with the water running, so Richard wouldn't hear from wherever he'd gone to watch television. Patricia was saying something to Brad. He was right. He just didn't know the specific words yet. The specific words were these: "He looked terrible," Patricia said. She had her back to the sink, her arms crossed. The water was running. "I'm not being unkind. I'm just, did you see that jacket?" "I saw it," Brad said. He was at the kitchen table with the last of the wine, his sport coat hung on the back of the chair. Courtney was in the living room on her phone, which was where she went when she understood that what came next wasn't for her. 3 years and he shows up with a grocery bag, Patricia said. Shampoo Brad. I know. I'm saying that something has clearly not worked out. She picked up a dish and rinsed it with the careful efficiency of a woman who's been managing household things for 20 years. Your father doesn't need to know the details. I don't think it would help him to know the details. Brad turned the wine glass in his hands. You think he's broke. I think he is not doing well. She put the dish in the rack. The way he just appeared, no call, no in the bag. You don't bring soup cans to somebody's house if you have soup cans at home. That's what I think. Brad was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad's gonna want to help him. I know that. He's going to want to. I know, Brad. I know. Patricia turned off the water. Which is why we need to be smart about this. Your father lost nearly $200,000 on those properties. He doesn't have... She stopped, recalibrated. We are not in a position to absorb Marcus's problems on top of our own. Brad set down the wine glass. What do you want to do? Patricia picked up another dish. I want to find out what exactly is going on with him before your father gets any ideas. That's what I want to do. She rinsed the dish. Can you talk to him? Marcus doesn't exactly open up to me. I know that, but you could reach out. Say you're checking in. You're brothers. Stepbrothers. He doesn't know the difference. She set the dish in the rack. Just feel it out. Find out where he's actually living, what he's actually doing. Don't push. Just ask. Brad looked at the wine glass for another moment. Then he picked up his phone. Marcus's phone buzzed on the nightstand at 11:14 that night. He was still awake, which he always was, at 11:14. He'd been working since he got back to the room, reading through the Singapore files, making notes on a yellow legal pad, the way he'd done since business school, because he thought better with a pen in his hand than a keyboard, and the buzz was almost a relief from the concentration. He picked it up and looked at the screen. Brad Conroy. He stared at it for a second. Then he set the phone back down without answering and went back to his notes. Brad called twice more in the next 20 minutes. Marcus let it go both times. On the third call, he picked up. Hey, Brad said. Hey, sorry, I know it's late. I wanted to check in. We didn't really get to talk at dinner. We talked, Marcus said. Yeah, I know, but a pause. Brad reorganizing. I felt bad about some of what I said, the soup can thing. I wasn't trying to. You didn't offend me, Brad. Right. Okay. Good. Another pause. The sound of television in the background low. Brad had either gone home or gone into another room. Look, how are you, man? Seriously, how are things going out there? Marcus leaned back in the desk chair and looked at the ceiling. There was something almost impressive about how quickly they'd mobilized. He'd been out of the house for 3 hours. Things are good, he said. Yeah, the consulting stuff is picking up. It's picking up, yeah, Good, good. Brad's voice was doing that thing where it was being friendly while also leaning forward. You still in the Bay Area? Different places, Marcus said. I move around a lot. Right. That sounds tough actually. Not having a home base. I manage. Yeah, I bet. A breath. Listen, I want to just say this because I think somebody needs to. We're all a little worried about you, Marcus. Not in a bad way. Just you disappeared for 3 years, man. You don't call. And then you show up and you look. He stopped himself. I look what? Marcus asked. His voice was still perfectly level. Like you've had a rough time of it. Brad said it carefully like he was diffusing something. And that's okay. That happens. Especially with the economy the way it's been, and if the business stuff hasn't, Brad, worked out the way you hoped, I just want you to know that you can. Brad. A little sharper this time, not angry, just precise. What is it you actually want to say? A long pause. We're family, Brad said. And if things are tight, there's no shame in things aren't tight. You brought soup cans, Marcus. I brought them because I wanted to bring something. Marcus sat forward now, both elbows on the desk. I do that sometimes. I bring things when I visit people. It's a habit. A habit from what? From when you were... From when I was a kid in this family, and I watched what happened to people who came to the table empty-handed, Marcus said. That's where the habit comes from. Silence. It stretched for long enough that Marcus could hear Brad breathing. I'm not going to need anything from this family, Marcus said. I promise you that, but I appreciate you asking. He could hear Brad deciding whether to push it or let it go. The internal math was almost audible. Okay, Brad said finally. Okay, I'm glad things are good. Thanks for calling, Brad. Yeah, right. Get some sleep. You too. Marcus set the phone down and looked at the legal pad in front of him. He picked up the pen and wrote one word at the top of a fresh page. Why? Not why had Brad called, that was obvious. The question was something bigger and older than that. It was the question Marcus had been carrying since he was 17 years old and standing in a kitchen being told to be realistic. The question of why people like Patricia, why people like Brad operated from such a fundamental assumption of other people's smallness. Why they needed to believe so urgently and so completely that the people they'd minimized had stayed minimized. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. He'd thought about this a lot. Real cruelty required intent, required someone to look at another person and choose to diminish them. What Patricia did, what Brad had learned to do from watching her, was more automatic than that. It was a kind of gravity. You stayed in your orbit. You didn't get bigger than the story that had been written for you. He'd gotten bigger. He'd gotten considerably bigger. And none of them had any idea. He sat there for a long time, turning the pen end over end, thinking. His mind moved the way it always did when something big was forming, not in straight lines, but in circles that got gradually smaller, spiraling in on a center that he couldn't quite see yet, but could feel getting closer. He thought about his father. He thought about Richard Hale at the head of that table, 20 pounds heavier and 20 years older, looking like a man who had put his trust in the wrong places and was quietly paying for it without knowing how to say so. He thought about $200,000 in property losses. He thought about a silver Mercedes in the driveway that was new enough to still have the dealer sticker on the windshield. He'd noticed it on the way out. A reflex registered, he was almost certain, to Patricia Conroy Hale. He thought about a lot of things. Then he opened his laptop and sent his assistant an email at 11:47 at night, and she responded at 11:50 because she was also still awake, which was something they had never discussed out loud, but which was simply one of the 1,000 small facts of the working relationship they'd built over 4 years. The email said, "Move up the timeline. I want to be back in town for at least 2 more weeks. Clear whatever you need to clear." Her response said, "Already done. Also, you should know the Journal reporter has a source inside your old holding company. I think it's the Halverson assistant. Letting you know. He wrote back, handle it. She wrote back, obviously. He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of the 14th floor with the city laid out below him, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself think about what it was going to look like when they all finally found out. The call from his father came the next morning at 7:42, while Marcus was on his second cup of coffee and his first round of emails. He answered it before the second ring. Marcus! His father's voice was low the way it got when he was somewhere in the house where he didn't want to be overheard. Probably the garage. Richard Hale had always done his real talking in the garage. I wanted to call before things got busy. Hey, Dad. Last night I should have said something when you were here. I wanted to. It's okay. It's not really. A pause. The sound of the garage, that specific dry silence of concrete and tools hanging on pegboards. I know things haven't always been... He stopped. Started again. I know Patricia can be a lot, and Brad does what Brad does. I see it, Marcus. I'm not blind. Marcus set down his coffee. I know you're not Dad. I just want to know that you're all right. Really. Not the answer you give to avoid the question. The real one. Marcus looked out of the window at the city below. The light was just starting to come good that particular morning, gold that hit glass buildings and broke into 100 smaller lights. He'd grown up hundreds of miles from any building that looked like this, in a house on a street where the gutters needed cleaning, and this city, and this light felt like something he'd built out of will and stubbornness and years of not sleeping enough. I'm all right, Dad, he said. I'm genuinely all right. But there are some things I want to talk to you about. When we can do it without an audience. A long pause from the garage. When? His father asked. Soon, Marcus said. I'm going to be around for a little while. Another pause. And in it, in the weight of that silence, Marcus heard something he hadn't heard from his father in a very long time. Something that was the opposite of the resigned, careful distance his father had been keeping for years. Something that sounded like hope. Okay, Richard Hale said. Okay, son. Marcus stayed on the phone a little longer than he needed to. They talked about the truck and the neighbor named Pete who'd had a hip replacement and the weather that was coming later in the week. Small things, the mortar between bigger things. By the time they hung up, Marcus had drunk the rest of his coffee cold without noticing, which was something that only happened when his mind was fully somewhere else. He looked at the yellow legal pad on the desk, at the single word he'd written at 11-something the night before. Why? He picked up the pen. Underneath it, he wrote a second word. How? Because the why. The reason behind all of it. The gravity that kept people in their assigned orbits, the machine that had been running in that house on Delwood Lane for 20-some years, he understood the why. The how was the question that mattered now. How do you dismantle something that's been standing long enough that people have stopped seeing it as a machine and started seeing it as the walls of the house itself? You don't do it from outside, he thought. You do it from inside. He put down the pen, opened his laptop, and got to work. His assistant's name was Renee Cole, and she had a gift that most people in Marcus's world underestimated because it came packaged in a quiet, unhurried manner that people confused for slowness. She was not slow. She was precise. There was a difference, and Marcus had understood it within the first 2 weeks of hiring her, which was why she was still there, 4 years later, running the operational reality of a company that most people in this city didn't know existed under his name. She called him at 9:15 with the information he'd asked for. Your father's situation, she said, and he could hear the file opening on her end. Richard Hale. 3 properties, he had 3, not 2. Sold 2 in the last 14 months. The first one went for about $60,000 under market value because he needed to move it fast. The second one, he did a little better, but not enough to recover the difference. Net loss is closer to $230 than $200. She paused. There's also a second mortgage on the house on Delwood Lane. Opened 18 months ago. Balance is right around $94,000. Marcus was at the desk by the window. He didn't write anything down. He just listened. "And Brad," he said. "Brad Conroy. Another page turning, or the digital equivalent of it. He owns a residential contracting business out of Westlake. Conroy Home Solutions, LLC. Filed in 2019, had a decent run during the renovation boom in 2021 and 2022. And then? She let that and then land on its own. He took out a significant loan against the business to buy into a commercial real estate venture with 2 partners. That venture is currently underwater. He's not in default yet, but his debt-to-income ratio is..." She paused. "It's not good, Marcus." "How not good?" "The kind of not good where if 1 or 2 things go the wrong way over the next 6 months, the business might not survive it." Marcus leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. "What about the house they're renovating?" Courtney mentioned Westlake. "Pulled permits. They started a kitchen and master bath expansion in August. The contractor, not Brad's own company, which is interesting, filed a lien in October for unpaid work. Lien's still active. So they're behind on the renovation. By about $40,000 if the lien is accurate." He was quiet for a moment. In his mind, he was laying these facts out like cards on a table, turning them over one by one, looking at what they meant individually and what they meant arranged together. What they meant arranged together was this: the house on Delwood Lane, which Patricia managed with the confident air of a woman who had everything organized, was actually sitting on a fault line. Richard had been bleeding money quietly for a year and a half. Brad was leveraged past what his business could comfortably hold. And Patricia, who had looked at Marcus's grocery bag with something so close to contempt that only the thinnest veneer of social grace had covered it, was living in a version of reality that was running on fumes and surface maintenance. "One more thing," Renee said. "The Mercedes. I saw it. Leased. 18 months into a 36-month lease. Monthly payment is $1140. A pause. "The lease is in Patricia's name, not a joint account." "Not a joint account," Marcus repeated. "No." He thought about that. Patricia had always been smart about money in the way that people are smart when they are primarily concerned with their own position. The separate lease wasn't a red flag exactly, but it was a data point. It was the kind of thing you did when you were managing an exit strategy quietly while maintaining a household loudly. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." "What are you going to do?" Renee asked. "I don't know yet," he said. Which was true partially. He knew the broad shape of it. The specific architecture still needed work. "Be careful," she said. "I'm always careful." "You're usually strategic," she said. "Careful and strategic are not always the same thing, especially when family is involved." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he just said he'd call her before the Singapore meeting, and they hung up. He sat with the information for a while. Outside, the city was fully awake now, the morning gold replaced by the flat, bright light of midday. And people moved on the sidewalks below, with the focused urgency of people who had places to be and believed the places mattered. He thought about his father in the garage, talking low so Patricia wouldn't hear. He thought about Brad calling at 11 at night because Patricia had told him to. He thought about the second mortgage on the house where he'd grown up, and the way his father had looked across the dinner table like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long, he'd forgotten there was a time he didn't carry it. Then he got dressed, and he went to see someone. Her name was Donna Hale, and she was 59 years old, and she lived 20 minutes from Delwood Lane in a small house that she owned outright, because she had paid it off over 22 years of working as a school administrator and had never once bought anything she couldn't afford. She was also Marcus's aunt, his father's younger sister, and she was the person who had driven 3 hours each way twice a year, every year for the first 4 years, after Marcus's mother died, to make sure that the boy his brother was raising stayed in her word anchored. She answered the door before he knocked because she'd seen the Escalade come down the street, and she stood in the doorway, with her arms already open, and said, "Baby, get in here." And Marcus walked into the hug, the way he had at 7 years old, and at 14, and at 22, when his first company had failed, and he'd driven here without calling. And she'd opened the door then, too. She made coffee. She always made coffee. It was the first ritual of every visit the ceremony that meant you're safe here, and nobody is performing anything. They sat at her kitchen table, and she looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated attention that had always been her particular gift, the ability to see a person without arranging them into a story first. "You went to the house," she said, "last night." "And," he told her, "not everything, not the financials, not Singapore, not any of the operational details of his life that she didn't need and wouldn't have wanted. But the dinner. The way Patricia had looked at the grocery bag. Brad calling at 11. His father in the garage at 7:42 in the morning, keeping his voice low. Donna listened without interrupting, which she was exceptional at. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him for a long moment. "You went there looking like that on purpose," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why?" "I needed to see who they'd be if I walked in with nothing." She nodded slowly. "And you saw it." "I saw it." She was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. A car went past outside. Then she said, "What did you see with your father?" And Marcus told her about the 1 second. The unguarded second before the walls went up. The relief in his father's eyes before it closed back over. Donna looked down at her cup. "Your father loves you," she said. "He has always loved you. He just never learned how to do it without letting Patricia translate it first, and Patricia's translations have a way of losing something in the process. I know that. Do you—" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She lifted her eyes. "I mean that you know it intellectually. I'm asking if you know it the other way. The way that lets you go back to that house without needing them to be worse than they are to justify your own hurt." She held his gaze. "Because some of what you're building, Marcus, whatever it is you're building, because I know you well enough to know, you don't just show up and observe without a plan. Some of it needs to come from love, not score settling, or it'll hollow you out." He was quiet. She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just telling you to know why you're doing it." This was why he came here before anywhere else. Not because she told him what he wanted to hear, because she told him what was true, and she did it without needing him to feel bad about it. "I want to help Dad," he said. "That's real. I know it is. And I want to—" He stopped, searched for the honest word. "I want Patricia to have to see it. I want her to have to stand in a room and understand that the version of me she wrote off has been—" He stopped again. "Has been what?" He looked at his hands. "Has been building something she can't touch and couldn't have imagined." Donna set down her cup. "Okay," she said. "That's the real answer. Both things are true, and they can both be true. Just know which one is which." She reached across and put her hand over his for a moment. Just briefly. "Now tell me what you actually built." He looked up. She smiled the smile she'd been giving him since he was 7 years old. The one that said, "I already know you're extraordinary. I just want to hear you say it out loud." So he told her. He'd never said it all in sequence to anyone who wasn't a lawyer or an investor. He laid it out now, the first company he'd built out of his apartment in his late 20s and sold for enough to start the second. The second company, which had gone sideways for 18 months before pivoting into something that nobody had thought to try, and which had turned out to be exactly what a specific corner of the logistics market needed. The third round of funding. The Singapore expansion. The Halloran acquisition that had closed 6 months ago and had quietly doubled the size of everything he'd already built. He talked for almost 20 minutes without stopping. Donna listened to every word. When he finished, she sat with it for a long moment, looking at the table. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were wet, which was the only time he'd ever seen anything close to that. And she blinked it away with the quick efficiency of a woman who had done hard things her whole life and was not embarrassed by her feelings, but also wasn't about to be derailed by them. "Your mother would have—" She started and then stopped and started again. She would have been so loud about it. You know that. She would have been on the phone to every person she'd ever met. Marcus smiled. The real one. The one he didn't give to boardrooms. I know. You look like her when you smile like that. I know that too. They stayed at the table a little longer. Donna refilled their cups. She asked practical questions, not nosy ones, but precise ones, the way she'd always asked, and Marcus answered all of them. When he got up to leave, she walked him to the door and held his arm for a moment. One thing, she said. Yeah. Your father needs to know the truth. Not as a revelation, not as a moment. He needs to know it quietly from you before anything else happens. He deserves that. She looked at him steadily. Promise me that part comes first. It will, Marcus said. That's the first thing. She held his arm a moment longer, then let go. Good, she said. Now go do whatever you're going to do. He called his father that afternoon and asked if he wanted to get breakfast the next morning. Just the two of them, away from the house. His father said yes before Marcus finished the sentence. They met at a diner on Calloway Street that had been there since before either of them was born, a place with red vinyl booths and coffee that came in white ceramic mugs and a menu that hadn't changed since 1994. Richard Hale was already in a booth when Marcus arrived, which meant he'd been early, which meant the invitation had mattered more than he'd let on when he agreed to it. Marcus slid in across from him. The waitress came, took their order eggs and toast for Marcus, the same for his father, and then left them to the morning. For a moment they just sat with the coffee. Then his father said, I didn't sleep much last night. Me neither, Marcus said. I keep thinking about, I want to say some things I should have said a long time ago. Richard wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table. About the way things were. After your mom died. The way I handled things or didn't handle them. He cleared his throat. About Patricia. Dad, let me finish. He looked up. I know how it was for you in that house. I knew it then, if I'm honest. I didn't know how to fix it without blowing the whole thing up, and I was scared to blow the whole thing up because I didn't know what was on the other side of that. He exhaled. That's not an excuse. It's just I want you to know I wasn't blind. I was a coward, and those are different things. Marcus looked at his father at the creased, honest face of a man who'd just said the hardest true thing he probably knew how to say. I know the difference, Marcus said quietly. I should have been better. Yeah, Marcus said. You should have. He said it straight, no buffer. Then, and I don't need you to have been perfect, Dad. I just needed you to be in my corner, and there were times you weren't. He held his father's gaze. But I know you loved me. I've always known that. His father's jaw worked for a moment. I did, he said. I do. I know. The eggs came. They ate. Slowly, unhurried, the way two men eat when they're not in any rush to get to what comes next, because the right now is already important. Halfway through his eggs, Marcus set down his fork. I need to tell you something, he said. His father looked up. The consulting work, Marcus said. It's more than I let on the other night. Okay. A lot more. He paused. I built something, Dad. Over the last 12 years, I've been building something, and it's significant. And I need you to understand that before anything else happens in the next few weeks. His father set down his own fork. The diner moved around them, the other tables, the waitress, the low sound of the radio from the kitchen, and none of it touched this particular booth. What do you mean by significant? His father asked. Marcus told him. He watched his father's face as he laid out the basic shape of it. Not the details, not the structure, just the honest size of the thing he'd built. He watched the numbers land. He watched Richard Hale process a reality that was fundamentally different from the one he'd been operating inside of, the one where his son had disappeared out west and was doing okay, probably hopefully. His father didn't say anything for a long time after Marcus finished. He picked up his coffee mug, put it down without drinking. He looked out the window at Calloway Street, and Marcus watched something move through his father's face that he couldn't fully name. Too many things at once layered over each other. Some of them pride, and some of them grief, and some of them a complicated shame that had nothing to do with Marcus, and everything to do with a man looking at the gap between who he'd been and who he wished he'd been. "You did all of this," his father said. "By yourself." "Not entirely by myself," Marcus said, "but mostly." His father nodded slowly. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't." "Why didn't you?" he started. "Because I needed to be sure it was real before I said it out loud to the people who mattered," Marcus said. "And then once it was real, I needed to figure out what I actually wanted to do with it." He looked at his father directly. "I'm figuring that out now." Richard Hale looked at his son across the red vinyl booth in the diner on Calloway Street in the morning light, coming through windows that hadn't been replaced since before Marcus was born. And for the second time in 2 days, something real moved across his face. But this time, it didn't close back up. This time, he let it stay. "I'm proud of you," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "I know I haven't said that the way I should have, for a long time." He stopped. "But I'm proud of you, son. I want you to know that." Marcus picked up his coffee. He didn't trust his own voice for a moment, which was unusual for him, and which he acknowledged silently, without embarrassment. "Thank you, Dad," he said. They finished breakfast. They sat in the booth for another hour after the plates were cleared, talking about things that had been waiting a long time to be said, taking turns being careful, and taking turns being direct, finding the particular rhythm that fathers and sons find when they finally decide to stop performing the relationship and just have it. When they walked out onto Calloway Street, his father paused on the sidewalk. "Patricia doesn't know any of this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Marcus said. His father was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to tell her?" Marcus looked up the street. The Escalade was parked half a block down Darnell behind the wheel, waiting without watching. "She's going to find out," Marcus said. "I just want to make sure the right things are in place first." He looked back at his father. "I need a few more days, Dad, and I need you to not say anything yet." His father studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see him doing the math, weighing the marriage he'd built on this street against the son who'd built something on the other side of the country and had come home asking for a few more days. "Okay," his father said. Marcus nodded. They shook hands. Then his father pulled him in brief and hard and clapped him twice on the back, and it was the most his father had ever physically said to him without words. Then Richard Hale turned and walked back toward his car, and Marcus stood on the sidewalk watching him go, and the thing he felt in his chest was complicated and real, and not fully resolved, and he didn't try to simplify it. He just let it be what it was. Then he pulled out his phone, called Renee, and said, "It's time to start moving." "What's first?" she said. "The house," Marcus said. "Start with the house." Renee moved fast when she was given permission to move fast, which was one of the things Marcus valued most about her. By the time he got back to the hotel that afternoon, she had already made 3 calls, sent 2 emails, and set in motion a process that was quiet, the way a river is quiet, not loud, not dramatic, but moving continuously and with considerable force. "I talked to your real estate attorney," she said when he called her from the elevator. "He's going to reach out to the mortgage holder on the Delwood Lane property. We can structure a payoff quietly, have it done inside of a week, and your father's name doesn't have to come up anywhere in the initial contact." "Good." "He did say," she paused, "he did say that if Patricia is on the mortgage, which she is, she'll be notified when it's paid off. There's no way around that." "I know. You're okay with that." "It's not about being okay with it," Marcus said. It's the sequence that matters. Dad knows first. The mortgage gets handled, then everything else becomes visible in the order it becomes visible. Okay, she was writing. And Brad's situation. Leave that alone for now. You don't want to. I want to take care of my father's house, Marcus said. Brad's problems are Brad's problems. If he asks for help later, we'll have a different conversation. But I'm not going to fix something for somebody who spent last night on the phone trying to find out if I was broke. Renee was quiet for exactly 1 second, which was her version of acknowledged. Understood, she said. One more thing. The Journal reporter published this morning. Marcus stopped walking. He was in the hotel corridor 20 feet from his room. What did they run? It's measured, actually. They have the Halloran acquisition. They have your name attached to it. They have the general scale of the holding company. They don't have the Singapore piece yet, and they don't have a personal angle. It's mostly financial reporting. Who's the byline? Karen Merritt. He knew the name. She was good, careful, and thorough, the kind of journalist who ran things only when she was confident they were right. Okay, he said. Don't fight it. If she calls again, let her know we'll give her a one-time comment for any follow-up piece. Nothing on background, on the record only. You want to do press. I want to control when the story gets told, he said. There's a difference. He went into his room and sat at the desk and read the article on his laptop. It was well reported and professionally restrained and told enough of the truth to make the rest of it findable if you were looking. He read it twice, then closed the laptop and thought about how long he probably had before someone in his family found it. The answer, it turned out, was 31 hours. Patricia found it on a Friday morning, and Marcus knew this because Brad called him at 10:17 while he was in a coffee shop on the north end of the city going over Singapore logistics with one of his operations managers. He excused himself from the table and took the call outside. What's going on? Brad said. His voice was doing something new, not the careful, managed friendliness of the late-night call, not the practiced social ease of the dinner table. It was tighter, higher, the voice of a man who had opened a door he didn't know was there and was standing in the frame, not quite believing the room on the other side. Good morning, Brad. Marcus, I'm looking at an article in the Wall Street Journal that has your name in it. A pause, in which Marcus could hear Brad deciding how to frame the next thing. It says it's talking about a company called Hale Meridian Holdings, and an acquisition that was worth it, says. He stopped. How much of this is accurate? What specifically are you asking? Is this you? Is this your company? Yes. A long silence. Why didn't you? Brad started. Because it wasn't your business, Marcus said. He said it without heat. Factual, the way he'd told Patricia she wasn't Marcus's mom. I don't owe you a financial disclosure, Brad. We're not close in that way, and we never have been. We're family. You said that the other night, too. Marcus leaned against the exterior wall of the coffee shop. The morning was cold and gray, the kind that made the city look like a photograph of itself. Family means different things to different people. In my experience in this particular family, it's mostly been used as a reason for me to explain myself. Another silence. Longer this time. Mom is... Brad started, then corrected himself, apparently remembering the dinner table conversation. Patricia is pretty upset. I imagine. She feels like you came to the house and she said it felt like a trick, like you were testing them. I was visiting my father, Marcus said. Marcus. I went to my father's house, Marcus said again more slowly. With a grocery bag, because I wanted to see him. Whatever Patricia felt about that visit, I'd encourage her to sit with that. The silence on the other end was different now. It wasn't processing silence or stalling silence. It was the silence of a man who was starting to understand for the first time and all at once how badly he'd misread the room he'd been sitting in for 20 years. She said, Brad started, then stopped. then started again. She told me you were probably struggling. She said that's why you showed up like that. She wanted me to call you and find out if you needed— I know what she wanted, Marcus said. Another pause. She's the one who found the article, Brad said. It came out quieter than the rest. She was on her laptop this morning and she found it, and she called me, and I could hear it in her voice, and I— He stopped. Marcus, I'm sorry. For the call. For the way dinner went. For the soup can comment. Marcus listened to this carefully. He was good at listening for the thing underneath the thing, the real structure under the words, the way a building's bones are different from its facade. The apology was genuine, he thought. But underneath it was something else. Brad was scared. Not of Marcus, not exactly. Of the realignment. Of what it meant for the story he'd been living inside the story, where he was the responsible one. The one who stayed. The one who'd done it right by being present. If Marcus had been quietly building something monumental the entire time he was gone. I appreciate that, Marcus said. And he meant it partially. Let's talk more when things are less charged. Right now, I think there's a conversation that needs to happen at the house, and I'd rather it not happen by phone. What kind of conversation? The honest kind, Marcus said. Tell Patricia I'll come by tomorrow morning. He hung up and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. A woman walked past with a dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The ordinary machinery of the world operating indifferently around what was for Marcus Hale a very non-ordinary moment. He went back inside and finished his meeting. Patricia called him herself at 2 in the afternoon. He answered, which he knew surprised her because she'd prepared for voicemail. He could hear the slight recalibration in her first half-second of silence. Marcus, she said. Her voice was controlled in the way that voices are controlled when a significant amount of energy is being spent on control. I suppose you've heard from Brad. I have. I want to say, she stopped. A breath. I want to say that I owe you an apology. For Wednesday night. For the way I received you. Each sentence came out deliberate and spaced, like she was reading from something she'd written down, or like she was speaking very carefully to avoid saying something she couldn't take back. If I made you feel unwelcome, that was not my intention. Marcus sat in the chair by the window looking at the city. It's all right, Patricia. It's not really. And there for just a moment was something underneath the control. Not genuine remorse exactly, but genuine discomfort, which was as close as Patricia was likely to get in a phone call. I want you to know that She paused again. I read the article. I know. You've built something very impressive. The sentence was careful and cost her something. He could hear it cost her. Thank you. I didn't know, she said. I want you to understand that. I know you didn't, Patricia. A silence. Why didn't you say something Wednesday you could have? What would have been different? He asked. Simply. Not accusingly. Just genuinely, what would have been different? She didn't answer, and the fact that she didn't answer was the most honest thing she'd said to him in 20 years. I'll come by tomorrow, Marcus said. We'll talk properly then. All right, she said. Her voice had gone quieter. All right, Marcus. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. He thought about Donna's voice at the kitchen table. Know which one is which. Love, not score settling. He thought about his father saying, I was a coward, and those are different things. He thought about the second mortgage on the house on Delwood Lane, and the fact that by Monday morning, if the attorney moved as fast as he expected, it would be gone. Handled. Quietly resolved the way Marcus handled most things that mattered to him, not with announcement, not with theater, but with direct and irreversible action. He picked up the phone and called his father. Richard answered in 2 rings. I heard from Brad, he said before Marcus could speak, which meant he'd also heard from Patricia, or had been in the room when the article was found, or both. His voice was measured, but there was something moving under the measure. Are you all right? Marcus asked. Yes, I'm trying to— His father stopped. gathered himself. Patricia is upset. I know. She's not upset she's not angry at you, she's... Another stop. She's embarrassed, Marcus, and I don't say that to excuse anything. I say it because I think you should know what's actually happening in this house right now. What's happening? His father exhaled. She sat at the kitchen table for about an hour after she found that article, and she didn't say anything. Just sat there, and I knew better than to push it, so I made coffee, and I put a cup in front of her, and I waited. A pause. And then she said to me, "Richard, did you know?" And I told her we'd talked. And she asked what I knew, and I told her the general shape of it, and He stopped again. "Dad." "She cried," his father said. "Patricia doesn't cry. Not in front of me anyway. Not in a long time." His voice was careful around this, the way you're careful around something that is genuinely complicated, rather than simply hard. I think she thought... He paused. I think she genuinely believed he was struggling. I think she built an entire picture of what his life looked like, and she believed it, and this morning that picture went away. Marcus was quiet. "I'm not defending her," his father said. "I want to be very clear about that. But I think you should know what you're walking into tomorrow." "I appreciate that, Dad. There's something else." His father's voice shifted, got lower, more careful. "The attorney called this morning, the one who handles mortgage things. He said there was going to be a payoff processed on the second mortgage." A pause. "Marcus?" "Yeah." "You can't..." "It's already done, Dad, or it will be by Monday." A long silence. "That's..." His father's voice broke slightly on the edge of the word and he stopped. When he spoke again it was controlled but just barely. "That's $94,000. "I know what it is." "Son?" "Dad." Marcus kept his voice steady and warm. "You spent 30 years working and building and giving everything you had to this family. And things got hard, and you didn't say anything because that's who you are. You don't ask. You don't call and tell your kid you're drowning because you don't want to be a burden." He paused. "I'm not a kid anymore. Let me do this." The silence on his father's end of the line was the longest of their entire conversation. When Richard Hale spoke again, his voice was rough in a way that Marcus had never heard from him in his entire life. Not breaking his father was too contained for breaking, but rough. Like something in the structure of it had shifted. "Your mother would have loved who you turned out to be," he said. Marcus pressed his lips together for a moment. He looked out the window at the city and breathed. "I'm trying to be somebody she'd recognize," he said. They stayed on the phone a while longer, talking practically about the attorney and the timing, and what Richard should and shouldn't say to Patricia before tomorrow morning. His father was calm and clear and engaged in a way that Marcus hadn't heard from him in years. Not the performance of calm, not the managed steadiness of a man holding things together, but actual clarity. The clarity of someone who has just had a significant weight removed from their shoulders and is relearning with some surprise what it feels like to stand straight. He arrived at the house on Delwood Lane at 10 the next morning. Not in a cab this time. The Escalade pulled up quietly, and Darnell stayed with the car, and Marcus walked up the 3 front steps in a coat that had no holes in the elbows. His father opened the door before he knocked. They looked at each other for a moment, and then Richard stepped back and let him in, and they walked to the kitchen together without speaking, because nothing needed to be said in transit. Brad and Courtney were at the kitchen table. Brad stood up when Marcus came in an instinctive automatic gesture that Marcus noted. Courtney stayed seated and looked at the table in a way that said she understood this wasn't her conversation, and she was working very hard to be appropriately invisible. "Marcus," Brad said. He put out his hand. Marcus shook it. "Brad." Brad sat back down. His face was different from dinner on Wednesday. The sport coat confidence was gone, and what was underneath it was someone younger and less certain. Someone who was trying to figure out where to put his hands now that the furniture had all been moved. Patricia was at the counter. She turned when Marcus came in, and he looked at her directly the way he always had, the way she'd sometimes tried to discourage by simply not meeting it. She met it now. She was composed. Whatever had happened at this kitchen table yesterday morning, the hour of silence, the coffee his father had put in front of her, the moment of tears, she had processed it and organized it and put it somewhere that allowed her to stand at this counter, in this silk blouse, and look at Marcus without flinching. But something was different. Not gone. Patricia didn't undo herself, but different. The particular quality of certainty that had always been behind her eyes, the absolute conviction that she had correctly assessed every person in every room she'd ever entered, was not entirely there. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," he said. He sat down at the table. His father sat across from him. Brad was to his left. Patricia brought her coffee and sat at the end, which was the seat closest to the counter, closest to an exit, he thought, though he kept that to himself. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Patricia set down her cup and looked at Marcus and said, "I want to apologize to you." The room was very still. "Not for the dinner," she said. "Or not only for the dinner. I want to apologize for—" She paused, and he could see her choosing the words with care, the way she chose everything. "For the way I treated you in this house when you were growing up. For the way I managed your place in this family." She held his gaze. "I told myself a story about who you were and what your life would be, and I treated you according to that story instead of according to who you actually were. That was wrong." The directness of it surprised him slightly. He'd expected something more armored, more couched in qualification. This was more naked than he'd anticipated. "I appreciate that," Marcus said. "I'm not asking for—" She stopped. "I don't expect it to fix anything. I know there are years of things behind this that a single conversation won't touch, but I want you to know that I understand what I did." She picked up her coffee cup, then put it down. "And I'm sorry for it. Genuinely." Brad was looking at the table. Courtney was still very carefully invisible. His father's hands were flat on the table in front of him, very still. Marcus looked at Patricia for a moment. He thought about 17 years old in this kitchen. He thought about Be Realistic. He thought about Donna saying love, not score settling, and the fact that those two things didn't have to cancel each other out, that you could hold both and choose which one to lead with. "I accept that," he said. And he meant it not as absolution, not as the erasure of anything, but as a genuine receiving of what she'd offered. "I don't need you to have been different. I needed to be clear with myself about what had happened. And I think I have that now." Patricia nodded once. Small and precise. She picked up her coffee and drank, and didn't say anything else, and he understood that she'd said everything she was capable of saying, and that asking for more would be asking for something she didn't have. He turned to Brad. Brad looked up. His face was open in an unguarded way that Marcus didn't think he'd ever seen from him before. "I should have been better to you," Brad said. "When we were younger, I followed her lead, and I shouldn't have because you were my brother and I let her tell me you weren't." He swallowed. "That's on me, not on her, on me." And that was more than Marcus had expected from him. That acknowledgement of personal agency, of his own choice to follow a lead when another choice was available. That was harder than anything Patricia had said, and it cost Brad more visibly to say it. "Yeah," Marcus said. "It is." He let it sit for a moment. "And I'm willing to build something different from here if you are." Brad nodded. "I am," he said quietly. Marcus looked at his father. Richard was looking back at him with those same eyes from Wednesday night, the real eyes, the unguarded ones, except now they weren't closing back up. They were staying open. "All right," Marcus said, and he put his hands on the table and said what he'd come to say. He told them about the second mortgage being handled. His father started to say something, and Marcus held up a hand, not dismissive, just steady, and kept going. He told them it wasn't charity, and it wasn't a transaction, and he didn't want it discussed or negotiated. It was something he was doing because his father had given him a foundation, imperfect as it was, and this was how he was choosing to return it. Patricia's face moved through several things very quickly. He watched her get to the place where she understood the number involved and understood what it meant, and he watched her understand that she had sat in this kitchen 2 days ago and looked at Marcus Hale's grocery bag with something close to contempt, and he could see all of that move through her in real time before she went still. She didn't say anything. That was fine. He wasn't looking for a response. He was just stating a fact. He told his father there were other things he wanted to talk about, longer conversations. Things about the future. Things about what Marcus wanted to build with the people he had left in his life who mattered. But those were for other mornings, other tables. Today was for this. Richard reached across the table and gripped Marcus's arm the way he had at the door on Wednesday night. That brief, firm thing. That was the most physical language his father knew. "Thank you," his father said. Marcus put his other hand over his father's for a moment. Just briefly. Then let go. He stood up. "I'll see you all soon," he said. He walked through the house, through the farmhouse table dining room, past the side table where his grocery bag had sat like something to be discarded, through the hall, where the coat hooks still held the same shapes they always had, and out the front door. On the porch, he stopped. The November air was cold and still, and the oak tree near the driveway moved slightly in something that wasn't quite wind. The Escalade sat at the curb, Darnell reading behind the wheel without looking up. Marcus stood there for a moment and let the morning settle over him. He'd spent 17 years building something they couldn't have imagined, and he'd done it without this house in his corner, without this family in his corner, carrying the weight of being written off before he'd written a single real line of his own story. That was true. That would always be true. But he was 35 years old, and standing on this porch in a coat without holes, and his father's grip was still in his arm, and somewhere in that kitchen, Patricia Conroy Hale was sitting with a reality she hadn't expected, and Brad was looking at his hands and rethinking 20 years of assumptions. And the thing in Marcus's chest was complicated and real, and not fully resolved. But it was different from what it had been when he'd come up these 3 steps on Wednesday night. It was different in the direction of something like free. He walked down the steps to the car. He didn't fly back west the next day, or the day after that. He stayed, not at the hotel forever. By the end of the first week, he'd moved into a furnished apartment on the east side of the city. Something clean and quiet with good light, and room enough for a proper desk, and the kind of silence that let him work without the ambient noise of hotel corridors. Renee had found it in 40 minutes. He'd signed a 3-month lease without negotiating the rate, which was something he only did when he had already decided somewhere in himself that a place was going to matter. The Singapore deal closed on Tuesday as planned. He was on a video call at 6 in the morning when the final documents were executed. Watching Chen's face on the screen go from composed to genuinely pleased, which for Chen was the equivalent of most men throwing a party. Renee was on the call too, taking notes on a separate screen, and when it was over and the call ended, she looked at the camera and said simply, "That's the one." And Marcus said, "Yeah." And they sat with it for a moment before she went back to being operationally brisk, and he went back to his coffee. It was the largest single transaction he'd ever completed. $430 million of structured equity, 3 years in the making, a deal that had almost fallen apart twice, once because of a regulatory issue in Q3 of the previous year, and once because of a personality conflict between 2 of the senior partners that Marcus had resolved by having a private dinner with each of them separately and never mentioning the conflict directly. The deal that had been the reason he was on a plane the day he'd decided to come home in a jacket with a hole in the elbow. He sat with his coffee and thought about that for a while. Then he called his father and asked if he wanted to go back to the diner on Callaway Street. "When?" his father said. "An hour." He could hear Richard already looking for his keys. They had a different kind of breakfast this time. Not the careful weighted thing of 2 weeks ago where every sentence was being chosen from a long backlog of unsaid things. This was easier, looser. His father ordered the same eggs and toast out of habit, and Marcus ordered pancakes because he'd been eating from room service and hotel menus for 3 weeks, and pancakes were. He had decided the thing he actually wanted. They talked about this deal. The way Marcus almost never talked about business with anyone outside of work openly in plain language, without the protective scaffolding of corporate terminology. He told his father what it had taken to get there. Not the financials, but the actual human cost of it, the years of building when nothing was guaranteed, the deals that had failed, the version of the company that had almost collapsed in 2019 because of one bad hire at the CFO level, who'd hidden a cash flow problem for 6 months. His father listened. The way he'd always listened when Marcus was a kid, talking about something he cared about. Slightly leaned forward. Coffee going cold, not interrupting. It was one of the things Marcus had always loved about him, without having a name for it when he was young. "You never thought about quitting?" his father asked. "Every bad quarter," Marcus said. "But quitting and thinking about quitting are different things. I thought about it plenty. I just never got to the part where I actually did it." His father nodded. He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I quit something once," he said. "You probably don't know this. Before I met your mother, I had a business. Small thing, a landscaping and property management company. 2 employees, me. We were doing okay." He looked at the table. "And then a big contract fell through and one of my employees quit. And I didn't push back through it. I let it go." He exhaled. "I've thought about that a lot over the years. What would have happened if I hadn't?" "What made you let it go?" His father looked up. "Fear," he said simply. "Just fear. There's no more complicated answer." He picked up his mug. "You didn't let the fear win." "I let it push me," Marcus said. "There's a difference. Fear's not useless. It's just not supposed to be in charge." His father smiled at that small and real, the kind of smile that belongs entirely to the person making it and isn't for anyone else's benefit. "Your mother used to say something like that," he said. "She'd probably say, 'I'm still figuring it out.' She'd probably be right." His father put down the mug. She'd also be extremely loud about how proud she was in every possible direction to anyone who would listen. Marcus laughed, a real one. "Yeah," he said, "she would." They stayed at the diner for 2 hours. When they left, they stood on the sidewalk in the winter cold, and his father said almost casually, almost like it wasn't a large thing, "Come for dinner Sunday. Just the 2 of us. Patricia's going to her sister's in Baltimore." Marcus said he'd be there. The thing that happened with Brad was slower and less dramatic and ultimately more interesting to Marcus than the morning at the kitchen table had been. It started with a text 4 days after the kitchen meeting that said simply, "Hey, you have time to grab coffee sometime. No agenda attached, no visible purpose, just a direct ask." Marcus said yes. They met at a place Brad chose, a coffee shop in Westlake that was closer to Brad's house, which Marcus understood was a small act of control and was fine. Brad was already there when Marcus arrived, which was new. Brad had always been the kind of person who arrived exactly on time, never early, because arriving early communicated eagerness, and Brad didn't do eagerness. He'd ordered a coffee for Marcus already. Black, which was correct, which meant Brad had paid enough attention at some point to know how Marcus drank his coffee, which meant he'd been paying more attention all along than he'd ever let show. "Thanks for coming," Brad said. "Sure." Marcus sat down, picked up the coffee. "What's going on?" Brad turned his own cup in his hands. He was dressed differently than Marcus had ever seen him. Not the sport coat over the polo, not the social armor. Just a good sweater and jeans. He looked younger, less managed. "I've been thinking about something you said," Brad started. "At the kitchen table, you said you were willing to build something different from here if I was." He looked at Marcus directly. "I've been turning that over. What does that actually mean to you concretely?" Marcus put down his cup. He'd thought about this too. Not in terms of what he wanted to give Brad, because this wasn't about Brad as a beneficiary, but in terms of what he actually wanted out of whatever came next with this person. He'd spent a childhood alongside, without ever really being alongside. It means we're honest, Marcus said. Not performing. Not doing the version of a relationship where you call at 11 at night because Patricia asked you to feel me out. The actual thing. Brad looked at the table. I should have told you she asked me to call. Yeah. I didn't tell you because... He stopped. Because telling you would have meant admitting I'd done what she asked without questioning it, and I was trying to convince myself I was doing it because I actually cared. And did you care? Brad looked up, held Marcus's gaze for a moment. I think so. In the background, underneath the way I'd been taught to think about you, there was probably something real. He exhaled. I'm 40 years old, and I'm still doing what my mother tells me. That's not a great thing to see clearly about yourself. No, Marcus agreed. But seeing it clearly is the first step to not doing it anymore. Brad was quiet for a moment. Then, my business is in trouble. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying alone for a long time and have finally just decided to set down somewhere regardless of consequence. The commercial venture, I'm over-leveraged. I've been trying to manage it without telling Patricia or Courtney how bad it actually is. He picked up his cup. And there's a lien on the house renovation. I know, Marcus said. Brad looked at him. I looked into it, Marcus said. Not to judge it, to understand what I was walking into. Brad absorbed this. You knew when you were at the kitchen table. Yes. And you didn't say anything. Because it wasn't the moment for it, Marcus said. That morning was about something else. This. He gestured between them. This is the right moment. Brad looked at his coffee. I'm not asking you to... I know you're not, Marcus said. Tell me what you actually need. Not what you think you should ask for. What you actually need. Brad put down his cup and leaned forward. And for the first time in 36 years of being in the same family, he told Marcus Hale the truth about where he stood. It took about 15 minutes. Marcus listened to all of it, without interrupting, asking 2 or 3 clarifying questions, practical, specific about the debt structure and the timeline and the state of the business's underlying contracts that Brad answered with something that looked like genuine relief. The relief of having someone respond to the real information rather than the social surface of it. When Brad finished, Marcus sat with it for a moment. I'm not going to hand you a solution, he said. That's not how I work, and it wouldn't actually help you. He leaned forward. But I have people who can look at your business structure and tell you whether there's something salvageable in the model. And if there is, there are ways to restructure the debt that you probably haven't been told about, because you haven't had the right people in the room. He held Brad's gaze. If you want that, I'll make the introductions. You do the work. You make the decisions. I don't own any piece of your business, and I'm not going to. That's the condition. Brad looked at him for a long moment. Why? He said. Not suspiciously, genuinely. After everything. Because you're my brother, Marcus said, and those are different things. He watched Brad take that, watched him understand that Marcus was using the word back, the word Brad and Patricia had deployed as leverage and expectation for 20 years and was using it as something different, as something actual. Brad nodded. Okay, he said. His voice was quieter than Marcus had heard it. Okay. Thank you. They stayed for another half hour talking about things that had nothing to do with money or business. Courtney's pregnancy, which Brad mentioned almost in passing, and then immediately lit up about in a way he clearly hadn't intended to display. 3 months along. They'd been waiting to tell people. Marcus congratulated him, and meant it, and Brad's face did something warm and real and unguarded, and Marcus thought that somewhere under the sport coat and the managed confidence and the 20 years of being Patricia's instrument, there was a person who was going to be a decent father if someone gave him the room to be one. He hoped the kid got the room. The Sunday dinner with his father was the best of any of it. Richard cooked, which Marcus hadn't known he could do, or had forgotten maybe from some early memory before Patricia had taken over the kitchen as one of her managed domains. He made a pot roast the way Marcus's mother had taught him, he said 40 years ago, in the first year of their marriage, before everything that came after. They sat at the farmhouse table that was too big for the room and ate the pot roast and talked for 4 hours. They talked about Marcus's mother in a way they never had, not the careful, protected way that grief manages its subject for the first decade, but freely with humor and specificity, and the particular love that has been seasoned by time into something that can be picked up and held without shattering. His father told him things he'd never known, about the early years of the marriage, about Marcus's mother's stubbornness, which was legendary, and her laugh, which his father said could change the temperature of a room, about a trip they'd taken to Maine the summer before Marcus was born, when they'd gotten lost on a coastal road at night, and his mother had insisted on navigating by the stars because she didn't trust the map. "We ended up in someone's driveway," his father said, smiling in the way he'd smiled at the diner, the small real one, not for anyone's benefit. "About 11 at night, the homeowner came out with a flashlight and your mother just told him we were navigating by stars, and he looked at her for a long moment and then invited us in for coffee." He shook his head. "She could do that. She could talk anyone into anything without them ever feeling talked into it." "She got that from somewhere," Marcus said. His father looked at him. "She'd say you got it from her." "I'd say she's probably right." After dinner, they sat in the living room with decaf. His father's doctor had limited his caffeine, a fact Marcus filed away as something to follow up on, and the television off, and the house quiet in the way that houses get quiet when the people in them have run out of performance and are just present with each other. "I want to tell you something," his father said. "Okay. About Patricia." He looked at his hands. I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to fix that or to have a different feeling about it than you have. What happened in this house when you were growing up was real, and it was wrong, and you don't owe anyone a comfortable version of your feelings about it." He paused. "But I want you to know that I've talked to her, since the kitchen table, since the mortgage." He looked up. "Really talked. In a way I probably haven't since we got married." "What did you say?" Marcus asked. "I told her what I told you at the diner, that I saw it, that I was a coward instead of a father, and those are different things." He exhaled. She didn't defend herself, she just listened, and then she said something that I've been thinking about. "What did she say?" His father was quiet for a moment. "She said she'd spent so long being afraid that the life she'd built here wasn't secure that she'd made everything about securing it. And that somewhere in that process, she'd started seeing you as a threat to the security instead of as..." He stopped. "As a kid who needed someone to be in his corner." He looked at his hands again. "She said she'd known for a long time that what she did was wrong. She just didn't know how to put it down once she'd picked it up." Marcus listened to this carefully. He didn't rush to a response. He thought about Patricia sitting at the kitchen table for an hour in silence after reading the article. He thought about what it meant to build your entire sense of safety on a story about someone else's smallness and then have the story removed. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked. His father looked at him. The question had surprised him. Marcus could see it. "I think so," he said slowly. "I think she's going to have to do some work to get there. But yes." He paused. "You asked that," he said, without bitterness. "I'm trying," Marcus said. "Donna told me to know the difference between love and score settling." His father smiled. "That sounds exactly like Donna." "She's been saying the right things to me since I was 7 years old," Marcus said. "I'm only now getting fast enough to catch all of them." They sat in the living room until almost midnight. When Marcus stood to go, his father walked him to the door, the same way he had on Wednesday night 3 weeks ago, the night of the plastic bag, and the flickering porch light, and the beginning of all of this. But everything about this version of the walk was different. His father stood straighter. He moved without the weight that Marcus had seen in him at the dinner table, the compressed, careful heaviness of a man who'd been managing too much silence for too long. At the door, his father said, "How long are you staying?" "Few more weeks," Marcus said. "Maybe a little longer." "After that?" "I'll be back," Marcus said. "More than I have been. I'll be back." He held his father's gaze. "That's a real promise. Not the kind I make at the door and then disappear on. The actual kind." His father nodded. He put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, not the brief grip this time, but something that stayed a moment longer, heavier, the weight of 20-some years of insufficient saying, finally being said through the only physical language his father had. "Okay," Richard Hale said. "Okay, son." Marcus walked out to the car. The porch light came on behind him, steady this time, not flickering, and it lit the front walk all the way to the curb. He stood for a moment beside the Escalade and looked back at the house on Delwood Lane. The light was on in the living room. The oak tree near the driveway was still. The gutters still needed cleaning, and the split-level colonial was still slowly losing its argument with time, and none of that was going to be fixed tonight. But next week, Marcus had a contractor coming. A good one of the best in the city, someone he trusted to do the work properly, and not cut corners, and treat the house like it was worth caring for. Because it was. Not because of the property value, not because of anything on a balance sheet. Because his father had lived in it for 30 years, and it was the place that still held somewhere in its walls some residue of a life that had once been whole. Some things you fix because they need fixing. Some things you fix because the fixing is the thing you have to give. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale flew back west. He sat in the first-class cabin in the window seat he always took with his legal pad on his knee, and the city falling away below him through the oval window. And he thought about the trip, the way you think about something when you are sufficiently far enough inside it to finally see its edges. He had come home in a jacket with a hole in the elbow, carrying a plastic bag, and he had sat at a table where people who had known him his whole life had looked at him and seen exactly what they'd always believed he was. He had watched them be exactly who they were, with no performance required on their end, because they hadn't known one was needed. And he had taken that information and done the one thing he'd always done with hard information. He had built something with it. Not a weapon, not a monument to his own vindication. Something actual. Something that had his father standing straighter on a porch in November, and his brother in a coffee shop telling the truth for the first time in 40 years, and a woman who had spent 2 decades managing him, now sitting at a kitchen table, understanding what managing had cost her. He opened the legal pad to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote a date. Then he looked at the clouds below that brilliant white layer that meant you were above the weather, above the specific gravity of whatever was happening on the ground. And he thought about his mother navigating by stars on a coastal road at night, absolutely certain that the right destination was findable if you trusted the right instruments. He picked up the pen. He had $400 million and a family that was learning slowly and imperfectly what it meant to see him clearly. He had work that mattered, and people he trusted, and a father who answered the phone before the second ring. He had an aunt who said the right things, and a brother who was going to be a father, and a legal pad full of what came next. He had walked back into the place that had tried to make him small, and he had not needed them to have been better than they were. He had not needed the vindication to feel like victory. He had not needed the story to end with anyone diminished, not even the people who had once tried to diminish him, because the only ending that would have meant anything was the one where everyone who mattered was still standing when it was over. He wrote one word at the top of the page. Not why, not how. He wrote next, because Marcus Hale had never been the kind of man who stayed in any room longer than it took to understand what that room had to teach him. And he had learned what this one had to teach. Now there was work to do.